Hi ladies, this is lesson 4.5. It's solving quadratic equations by finding square roots. So in 4.3, we solved the quadratic equation by factoring out a coefficient in front of x squared. Then in 4.4, we solved by factoring with a coefficient in front of the x squared. And now we're going to solve for quadratics by finding square roots. So if you don't remember square roots, go back and look at the last video about radicals. So simplifying and adding and subtracting and multiplying radicals, because you'll need that information for this lesson. So the first term we have is the incomplete quadratic. And an incomplete quadratic is a quadratic function that is missing the linear term. So here is the normal quadratic function that you're used to in standard form. The linear term is the bx. So if it's missing that term, it means b equals 0. So a quadratic, an incomplete quadratic, is y equals ax squared plus c. It does not have a linear term. So you're missing the linear term. Alright, so let's look at a couple examples and we'll go through how to solve by using square roots. But the first step is to isolate the x squared. So whatever your squared term is, isolate that. Then you're going to find the square root of each side. Remember that the square root of x squared is positive or negative x. So when you simplify that radical, you have positive or negative x. And then finally you can solve for x. So let's look at this first equation. 1/2 times the quantity x minus 2 squared equals 8. Here is our squared term. Okay, that whole thing, x minus 2, is the squared term. Now, we do not want to FOIL. Let me just show you what happens when we multiply this out. So 1/2 x minus 2 times x minus 2. I'm just going to multiply out the x minus 2. I'm going to use FOIL. So that's 1/2 times x squared minus 4x plus 4. Now I have a linear term, so I cannot use square roots to solve for this. But before I FOILed it out, I did not have a linear term. I had a squared term, so I can use FOIL. So I'm not going to FOIL, I can use square roots. I'm not going to FOIL this out. I'm going to keep it how it is, and I'm going to simplify that x minus 2 as one term. All right, so in order to isolate the x minus 2, I have to multiply both sides by 2. So I get x minus 2 squared equals 16. Now I have to take the square root of both sides. That's my next step. Find the square root of each side. And I get x minus 2 equals positive or negative 16. Okay, so now if you remember from simplifying radicals, anytime we simplified a radical, we got positive or negative. If you're taking the square root of both sides, you're not going to have positive and negative on both sides because that would lead you to 4 answers. And 2 of those answers will be exactly the same. Okay, so when you're taking the square root of both sides, you just need the plus or minus on one side of the equation. And actually, it's not the square root of 16. It's not 16. The square root of 16 is actually 4. So our answer is x minus 2 equals positive or negative 4. Okay, now we can solve this. So if x minus 2 equals positive 4, we can solve for x. by adding 2 to both sides. So we get x equals 6. If x minus 2 equals -4, then we get, by adding 2 to both sides, we get x equals -2. All right, so let's look at the next one. We're going to follow the same steps. We're going to isolate our x squared term, and then we're going to take the square root of each side, and then we're going to solve for x. All right, so here we want to get our x squared term alone, and we're going to do that by adding both sides, adding 30 to both sides. So we get 5x squared equals 100. And now we can divide both sides by 5 to isolate our x squared term. So we get x squared equals 20. Now to solve for x, we have to take the square root of each side. So we get x equals the square root of 20. When we simplify the square root of 20, we get x equals the square root of 4 times the square root of 5, which gives us x equals positive or negative 2 times the square root of 5. So there's our answer for the first one, x equals 6 or x equals -2. Answer for the second one is x equals positive or negative 2 times the square root of 5. All right, let's now finally look at the third one. We want to isolate our x squared term. So we're going to do that by multiplying by 3 on both sides. So we get x plus 7 squared equals 24. Now we can take the square root of each side. And we get x plus 7 equals the square root of 24. So x plus 7 is equal to the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. So then x plus 7 equals plus or minus 2 times the square root of 6. And now we can subtract 7 from both sides. Now remember, we cannot add the 2 and 7 together because they do not have like radicands. So x equals positive or negative 2 times the square root of 6 minus 7. Again, we cannot combine these two because they do not have like radicands. So that's as simple as we can go. All right, let's look at the next part that you have on your note sheets. And this is the real life application stuff. So these are your word problems. And for this particular problem, we're going to use this equation h equals negative 16t squared plus h sub 0. So the speed of the object when you drop something, so if you've taken a physical science class or a physics class, the speed continues to increase until it reaches something called terminal velocity. So the speed continues to increase. So therefore, as the speed of the object falling increases, the height or the distance between the object and the ground decreases at a faster and faster rate. So we can use a quadratic for this. So the height is h, and that's in feet, of an object t seconds after it's dropped, can be modeled by this function. H equals negative 16t squared plus h sub 0. H sub 0 is the object's initial height. First thing I would always do when you're reading through one of these kinds of word problems is identify each variable. So it says an acorn falls out of the tree from a height of 40 feet. What is that 40 feet? So where does that plug in to your h, the t, or your h sub 0? Well, that's where the acorn starts. So h sub 0 equals 40. How many seconds? This is what you're looking for. So you don't know what your t is. Does the acorn take to reach the ground? So if it reaches the ground, that means the ending height is 0. So now that we have our equation or variables defined, we can actually plug those into our equation now. So our h is 0, so 0 equals negative 16. We don't know what our t is. So negative 16t squared plus h sub 0, which our h sub 0 is 40. So now we can solve this just like we've been doing this lesson, solving using square roots. So we can subtract 40 from both sides in order to isolate our squared term. And we get negative 40 equals negative 16t squared. Now we can divide both sides by negative 16. And we get 5/2 equals t squared. Now we can take the square root of both sides. So our answer is the square root of 5/2 equals t. Now, when we simplify the square root of 5/2 is when we'll get the plus or minus. Now, if you told somebody that you were going to be there in the square root of 5/2 seconds, they would be super confused as to what you're talking about. So when it makes sense to use decimals, you can use decimals. Even though there's not a decimal in this problem, this is a problem where it makes sense to use decimals. So go ahead and convert that square root of 5/2 into a decimal. And you get 1.58 plus or minus 1.58 equals t. Now, in the context of this problem, t stands for seconds. So which one of these answers makes sense? You cannot have negative time. So your answer does not include plus or minus. Those are the two solutions for t to make the equation true, but since t is seconds, you can only have positive time. All right, so there's one more. You can try this one on your own. So please work through it. Use that same equation that's on your note sheet. That your ending height equals negative 16t squared plus your initial height. So use that from your note sheet and identify your variables. So pause the video while you work. You can unpause for the solution. So here's our variables. Our ending height is 4. Our initial height is 20. And t, we don't know. We're looking for that. So after we set up our initial equation, we subtract 20 from both sides in order to isolate our variable. We get negative 16 equals negative 16t squared. Then when we divide both sides by negative 16, we get 1 equals t squared. And then finally, we solve for t by taking the square root of both sides. The square root of 1 is positive or negative 1. Since we're looking at time, we can only have positive 1. So t equals 1 second. So please jot down any notes that you have, and we can go over those in class next time I see you. Thanks.